Think about this issue of Native Americans, or Christianity, the Native American religious experience. I think it's impossible to speak of the Native American religious experience, particularly with Christianity, in the colonial period and up until the present. It's impossible to think about that apart from this violent and lamentable set of experiences and processes related to colonialism. Christianity represents for many Native Americans a deep hypocrisy, especially when you consider Native American history here in North America. That is to say that there's a vast gulf between the religion of peace and love that was offered, or at least professed, by European colonizers and the missionaries, and then the continual cyclical oppression, dispossession, violence, and hurt that natives experienced by the very people who said they were trying to convert them. This map helps us get a better sense of North America in the 15th century, just prior to when Europeans arrived. Scholars estimate there were likely between 10 and 12 million Native Americans north of the Rio Grande, as some estimates range between 2 and 18 million, so it's hard to know precisely how many Native Americans are present, as many as 100,000 Native Americans in New England alone. And this map helps us get a better sense because it does not contain the normal geopolitical boundaries that we're used to. Instead, it shows a continent teeming with native groups, tribes, activities that have their own networks of trade, their own creative artisan productions, agriculture practices, architectural feats, many of which are simply astonishing and don't really register into our view of pre-contact Native Americans. If you've traveled around the western part of the United States especially, you know that there are pockets of areas you can look at to find examples of this, though. Just two examples here are the Pueblo Bonito structure, or in the canyon here in New Mexico, and the towns on the left-hand side carved into the walls at Mesa Verde in Colorado. So the colonization of the New World gets underway in 1492 when Columbus sails the ocean blue and lands on an island in the Bahamas that he called San Salvador. The Spanish Empire quickly spreads and violently spreads in the Caribbean and the Americas, first encompassing the Caribbean islands, populated by millions of Indians in this time period, the Tainos, before moving inland to Central and South America. And along the way, the Spanish are ruthless. They enslave Indians and they conquer large chieftains. Unfortunately, Columbus and the Spanish were merely the beginning of what both scholars and Indians have referred to as the invasion of America. And again, I hope this sounds jarring to you. This is not the terminology we're used to using. We're used to think about colonization and settlers and more sort of peaceable terms. But nonetheless, I hope this map indicates it was an invasion into Indian territory in many ways. So there are several features, common features all across North America of this process of colonization. The first is that of enslavement and servitude. We forget that even before, for example, the Pilgrims landed in 1620, there had been 3 or 4 documented cases of British English traders coming up to the coast off of Cape Cod, pretending to trade, and then capturing 20 local Native Americans and taking them back to Spain, for example, from one famous example, and selling them as slaves to the Spanish. So when the Pilgrims show up in 1620, they've already had experience with Europeans, specifically the English, in the form of enslavement. The second common element is disease. Within 100 years, historians and demographers have estimated that natives in the Americas as a whole lost between 60 and 90% of their populations due to disease and warfare. The third common element of this colonization process is warfare. And I won't go into each of these different wars, but just to show you, these are only the sort of names of the major wars. And there are always skirmishes at every single location of colonization over time, wars over land, wars over resources, wars over mistreatment. So the fourth common element is land loss. The overall effect of colonization was a massive dispossession of natives of their land. And again, don't get me wrong, the point here is not to depress you, the point here is not to be revisionist, the point is to simply, I think, speak the truth about not only what happened, but also to capture a Native American perspective on these events. And if we're trying to think about issues of religion and evangelization from a Native perspective, This is the proper context and the point of view from which to start. Massive depopulation, warfare, land loss, all done by Christians. By Christians. Even if missionaries and the colonists were not always working together, the perceptions of natives, and they say this in the colonial period, is that they were all Christians, everyone, and they were all Europeans, and so therefore they were all connected somehow. So the first trend that I see, that I think stands out to me at least in terms of the colonial period, is the persistence of missionaries over time to reshape native cultures and religions. For most Christian missionaries in the early modern period, in the colonial period, religious and cultural conversion went hand in hand. Indians were encouraged to live in English-style houses, to speak the English language, to dress in English clothes, to cut their hair for the men, and to adopt English gender roles in terms of work, so farming for men instead of fishing and hunting. The English often saw fishing and hunting as being leisure activities, which is what it was back in England. They thought Indian men should work in the field, but in native culture, women worked in the field, not men, and so Native American or European missionaries had to sort of force a gender role reversal on Native Americans to more conform to European models. So the second trend that I see in my own work and research, and as I look out at the colonial landscape, is the creative and pragmatic response and responses by Native Americans. Native Americans proved themselves to be amazingly resilient, creative, and inventive. And the one time this happened the most, I think, was the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 1740s. People experienced these revivals, the broader population experienced these revivals as tremendously empowering. Anyone who experienced conversion and sincere religious experience could actually preach and talk about these experiences because religious experience was so highly valued. So laity, women, African Americans and natives, other socially marginal people, found themselves suddenly in a position of sort of spiritual equality, at least momentarily. During the First Great Awakening in the early 1740s, dozens of natives joined local white churches, which is why the title of my book is called The Indian Great Awakening. So it's intriguing, right? You have Native Americans joining churches, but as my research for a few churches showed, they didn't stay in these white churches for very long. This graph is intended to illustrate the specific timetable affiliations. This is data called from 3 different churches in Stonington, Connecticut, as a representative trend that I found more widely across New England. But what's also intriguing is that not all Native Americans who left local churches bailed on Christianity entirely. A native separate Christian movement took off in the 1750s and 1760s that included native-run churches and schools. One example of this is the Narragansett Samuel Niles, who in the 1740s affiliates with Christianity in the revivals. He joins a local white church, but soon breaks off and starts his own separate Indian church. They first meet in a wigwam, then eventually build a church and call it the Narragansett Indian Church, which, by the way, the congregation still exists today, and the church building, which dates back to the 19th century, is still on the Narragansett Reservation in southern Rhode Island. Well, Samuel Niles is interesting to me and fascinating because he was illiterate, he was unlicensed, and yet he received his religious authority directly from God, he said, through dreams, through visions, through religious impressions, and direct visitation from Jesus Christ himself, as well as angels. Over time, a small but significant percentage of Native Americans adopted Christian ideas and indigenized them in certain ways, intermingling traditional practices and Christianity. The third trend I see, in addition to the persistence of missionaries and the creative responses by natives, is that natives always felt they could never win. One particular tragic example is the massacre of 96 Moravian Christian Indians at the Moravian mission village of Gnadenhutten in Ohio in 1782. Early March of 1782, a Pennsylvania militia, shame on us Pennsylvanians, entered the village, rounded up all the Moravian Indians, accused them of participating in raids against frontier villages, which they had not been doing, at least not these particular natives. And the next day, on March 8th, 1782, lined all 96 of them up and killed them one by bludgeoning them on the head, one at a time, and then scalping them. all while the Moravian Indians, according to some reports, knelt passively and sang hymns and awaited their death. In the 19th century, I think the most famous example of this inability of natives to win is this somewhat famous story of the 5 civilized nations, so-called the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Seminoles in the American Southeast, specifically in response to expectations set out by the U.S. federal government and by missionaries. These 5 nations intentionally embrace all the different things that missionaries and the U.S. federal government were saying they needed to be considered to be civilized, to be fully civilized. So education, schools, written language, Christian churches, newspapers, a government with a constitution that was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. And yet, despite all this, despite being really at the pinnacle of what Europeans and Americans might consider to be fully civilized Native Americans, despite all of that, after the Federal Removal Act of 1830, the Cherokees and these other nations were forcibly marched westward at gunpoint to lands west of the Mississippi in present-day Oklahoma. And the 19th century contains more examples of this. Despite all this, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying you can blame missionaries for all this. My point is not to dump on missionaries as a category or missionaries in the colonial period, although surely they were often complicit. And I think this is really the reality that comes out of this long history. But I will say that in some cases, missionaries were one of the few groups who really cared about natives at all. One of the most inspiring groups of missionaries in the colonial period, I think, were the Moravians. Moravians were not, at least not initially, they were not colonists in the traditional sense. Moravians were also pacifists, so they're not violent and they're not wanting to recruit Indian warriors. Moravians were also more culturally tolerant, so not looking to completely eradicate native cultures. And finally, as I said before, the Moravians were focused on the heart and the blood and wounds of Christ that somehow struck a chord with the natives. So I think it's important to note that Native Americans still exist today by the millions all around the country, 1.5 to 2% of the population today in the United States. And it's important to remember that for Native Americans today, the legacies of the colonial period and the attempted evangelization that took place is still something that they wrestle with. Indian religious preferences are diverse, and there are many practicing Christians on every reservation. Some individuals I interviewed at Mashantucket in Connecticut, for example, said that they smoke the peace pipe traditionally, but see the smoke as prayers rising to Jesus. But to many natives today, the truth about American history is that Europeans and American Christians were hypocrites. As one native told me, missionaries always told Indians to obey the 10 Commandments, and yet white people themselves never kept the 10 Commandments. Do not kill, and yet white people waged wars against us, one woman told me. Do not steal, and yet white people took our lands. So in closing, I just say that the solution, I think, is not to give up on the missional vision of the church, but rather to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. The goal should be to listen, to dialogue, to learn, and to show with our actions what it means to follow Jesus. And at all times, I think we need to make sure that we are not conflating Christianity and American culture, that we're not confusing what it means to be a Christian with what it means to be an American, and that we're not insisting that to be a Christian, people need to become just like us.